your program.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I think it is officially afternoon now. My name is Randy Bender. It's a privilege for me to be on the board of the old Fort Meade Cavalry Museum at Fort Meade, South Dakota. And among the many troops that we had served at Fort Meade were members of the 25th Infantry, which was one of the black regiments that served in the late 1800s in our country. So our program today is the Buffalo Soldiers, their big beginnings and Dakota connections. So the name Buffalo Soldiers itself, it's a name that conjures up images from a Hollywood Western. It's the thundering hooves, the cavalry cresting a hill, the guidons blowing in the wind, the trumpet sounding the charge. But just exactly who were the Buffalo Soldiers? You know, at one time, these men made up almost 11% of the United States Army. They served from one end of our country to the other. In their first 29 years of existence, they earned 23 Medals of Honor. But where did they come from? What exactly did they do? How did they get their name? Well, black men have served in the United States military from our very beginnings. They served in the Revolutionary War. They served under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. But it wasn't until almost a year and a half into the Civil War. The guns had fired on Fort Sumter in 1860, and it wasn't until a year and a half later the blacks were allowed to serve as Union soldiers. And yet, by the time the war ended, almost 180,000 black men had served in the United States Army. 33,380 of them had paid the ultimate sacrifice. The statesman Frederick Douglass once said that once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth that can deny he has earned the right to citizenship. But even after the end of the Civil War, their role and future in the United States Army was uncertain. Once again, the United States reverted to its normal peacetime policy of shrinking the size of its army, and within a year of the war's end, the United States Army consisted of less than 55,000 men and officers. But owing to unsettled situations in the western frontier, tensions with Mexico, Congress in July of 1866 passed an act. Now a couple of things that were included in that was that it created 2 regiments of cavalry and 4 of infantry to be manned exclusively with colored troops. Well, over the years, by 1869, some changes and consolidations had occurred, and those all groups became the 9th and 10th Cavalries, the 24th and 25th Infantries. A senator at the time who was favoring their inclusion stood before Congress and said that if it was a privilege to serve in the Army, the colored troops had earned the privilege by their gallantry, and that if it was a duty, they should not be allowed to shirk it. An unusual addition to that bill, however, was a requirement that a chaplain was to be assigned directly to each regiment of colored troops. And he was not only responsible for the spiritual well-being of the men, but he was also to act as a teacher, instructing them in their 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. So, the Buffalo Soldiers began serving. This map shows all the different locations that they served in the early years. They started out in Kansas and Louisiana, and then they moved to Texas and Arizona. And they served honorably, fighting in many engagements, protecting frontier settlements. They surveyed and mapped the vast Texas plains. They built and repaired dozens of forts. They strung thousands of miles of telegraph lines, escorted countless wagon trains, stagecoaches, railroad trains, and cattle herds across the Southwest. And it also appears that during these early years is when the name Buffalo Soldier came into being. Now at first, it only referred to the men of the 10th Cavalry, but eventually it came to also include the 9th Cavalry, and eventually the 24th, 25th Infantries as well. But where did the name come from? Well, that story is a little clouded. It's been attributed to the Cheyenne. It's also been attributed to the Apaches and to the Comanches. Those were the Indian tribes that had the first experience of meeting with the black soldiers. The primary version of the story is that it was the similarity between the soldiers' dark skin and curly hair, a similarity that was only amplified in the wintertime when they wore a buffalo coat, that reminded the natives of the buffalo. But then in 1967, an author named William Lakey came out with a book entitled The Buffalo Soldiers. And in that book, he speculated that it was out of respect for their fighting abilities that the Native Americans gave this name to the black troopers. And this version is the one that is caught and held with the American society. However, most sources, including Native American sources, indicate that it really had more to do with their physical appearance. Also, from looking at historical documents, it appears unlikely that the troops viewed it as a compliment. The earliest reference that we can find to the name Buffalo Soldiers is from letters from an officer's wife in 1872, and then in an Army and Navy Review article written in 1873. And neither one of them are particularly positive references of using the name. Before 1911, we find no record of it in correspondence of the black troops, or in their papers, or in their magazines. About 1911 is when the 10th Cavalry added the buffalo to their crest. And about that time also we find an increasing use of the term buffalo soldier. Well, the 1880s saw a change of station and also a change of climate for many of the buffalo soldiers. The 25th Infantry was transferred to Dakota Territory in April of 1880. The 9th Cavalry came to the Department of the Platte in 1885, and they served in Nebraska and Wyoming. Meanwhile, the 24th Infantry, the 10th Cavalry, they remained down in the Southwest. Now, previous to their coming up here, there had been a great deal of debate as to whether black troops could handle the severe northern climate. Now, when they came north, the soldiers quickly learned that the summers in Dakota Territory were as brutal as anything that they'd experienced in the Southwest. The 25th, when they arrived at Fort Hale, they met degrees of 95 degrees in the humidity that you find along the Missouri River. Then, in early November, ice closed the river until the following April, basically stopping all communication with the outside world. Their duties changed from patrols to merely foraging and gathering the immense amount of wood that was needed for cooking and heating at the post. Buffalo soldiers proved themselves adaptable and ready to meet any challenge that was given to them. But as with any group of soldiers, the quality of food seems to have been a common complaint. And among the 25th at Fort Hale, this was no exception. The commanding officer noted in one of his reports that the absence of a competent baker has deprived the men of good and edible bread. But the 25th Infantry stretched across what would become South Dakota. They had companies stationed at Forts Randall, down at the tip, Fort Hale, a little bit north, Fort Sisseton, over by the Minnesota border, and Fort Meade, here in the Black Hills. Their service in our territory lasted from 1880 to 1888. Later, they were to serve at Fort Buford up by Williston, North Dakota, and also they served in Wyoming and in Montana. Now, the Old Post Cemetery at Fort Meade contains a lot of reminders of the harsh conditions that you'll find serving on a frontier military post. We have 192 graves in the little cemetery, Nearly 1/3 of those belong to children. But we also have a number of graves that hold the remains of Buffalo soldiers that served at Fort Meade, members of the 25th Infantry. The cemetery is the final home for 13 soldiers of the 25th. It also has the graves of 3 of their children, the 3-day-old daughter of their commanding officer, and the grave of their captain's wife. Now, of those 13 soldiers, 10 of them died from disease, anything ranging from typhoid to blood poisoning caused by an infection that he got during a vaccination. One of them was shot accidentally, and one of them was shot on purpose by a prostitute in 1884. And in case you're curious, she was acquitted on the grounds of justifiable homicide. So if you're keeping track, that accounts for 12 of the graves. The 13th grave belongs to a man named Corporal Ross Hallen. And this is not one of these shining moments in Sturgis history. Ross Hallen was killed as a result of frontier justice and racial prejudice. Hallen was accused of shooting Dr. H.P. Lynch in August of 1885. Hallen had a reputation for frequently beating his girlfriend, one Minnie Lewis, and she had sought treatment from Dr. Lynch, who had an office and pharmacy on Main Street in Sturgis, now the location of Sturgis Photo and Gift. Well, the doctor advised her to report Hallen to the post authorities. Well, word of this reached Hallen, and incensed, he borrowed a pistol and he went into town. And from here on, the stories and reports get a little confused. But circumstantial evidence indicated that he went to Lynch's drugstore. He saw him inside the store reading a paper, and through the front window, he shot him. Hallen was placed in protective custody in Sturgis City Jail. But later that night, he was broken out by a group of armed men, and the next morning, he was found hanging from Fiddler's Tree. The coroner's verdict? That he died from strangulation or some other climatic disease at the hands of parties unknown. When news of his lynching reached the fort, Hallen's company started to march on the city of Sturgis. It took a detachment of 7th Cavalry to stop them and return them to the post. And tensions between the 25th and the citizens of Sturgis remained high. They didn't improve for a while. Part of this is due to a man named Abe Hill. Now, Abe was a black proprietor of a brothel that catered to the black troops at Fort Meade, and he had cleverly built his place of business just outside the city limits and just before the boundary of the fort, approximately the area of the soccer fields today. He called it the Halfway House. And the road from Fort Meade to Sturgis passed directly in front of his building. Well, in September of the same year of Hallen's killing, there was another incident at Abe's Halfway House involving another shooting. Well, the good citizens of Sturgis asked that the colored troops be transferred. General Alfred Terry, he was the military commander of Dakota Territory at the time. He was well aware of the conditions in Sturgis City and also familiar with black troops from previous work with them. He also knew that white troops were often just as guilty of the same offenses, but were not held to the same standard of behavior. General Terry, in writing to the citizens of Sturgis, said this: "Notwithstanding the law, there are in the town 2 brothels, which would appear to have been established for the express purpose of catering to the colored troops. Had no such places existed, it is most improbable that any affray would have occurred. And if the people of Sturgis City suffer such places to exist, they must, I submit, expect the natural result of their existence. Until the people of the town have suppressed these dens, which equally debauch the troops of the post and threaten their own safety, they will not be in a position to ask the government to change its garrison. And the 25th Infantry stayed at Fort Meade for another 3 years. Well, not all relations with the 25th in the area were bad. We have numerous positive stories about their interactions. We had one Private William Perkins, who was known as a very shrewd businessman, and he developed a lucrative sideline. He baked pies and cakes that he sold for 50 cents each, more than doubling his army pay of $13 a month. And knowing that his comrades craved more substantial fare too, in one letter he wrote home that he bought 3 shoats and couldn't keep them. The men are always after good pork. There was a Private William Robinson, who worked as a nurse at the post hospital. He was known as being very competent and popular among all the troops. A member of the 7th Cavalry noted that he and I was on friendly terms. We joked most every day that I was in the hospital. Musicians from the 25th were popular throughout the Black Hills at any number of social gatherings. And the records of the 25th consistently show the quality of the majority of the troops. In a report from Fort Sisseton in 1886, the acting inspector general said, "The police of the post was admirable. Neatness, order, and cleanliness characterized every part of it. The ceremony of review was correctly performed. The march past in quick and double time was particularly well done. Subsequent inspection showed that the arms, belts, boxes, and military dress to all be in order." At Fort Randall, during the floods of 1881, the Buffalo Soldiers aided an estimated 800 civilians, providing them with food and clothing, often contributing to the relief effort out of their own pockets. They even rescued a herd of cattle that was being swept away down the river by driving them up onto the military reservation. And in 1882, they gave the area a strong sense of security by keeping the roads and rivers near the Rosebud Agency under continuous patrol for a month while the ghost dance was being held. The regimental band became famous throughout the region that had a reputation that stretched from Texas to Minnesota. Regimental reports consistently show them to have been competent, effective, and free, for the most part, of desertion, the Army's greatest personnel problem. In fact, the 24th and 25th Infantries proudly claimed the lowest desertion rate in the United States Army. But perhaps the 25th Infantry's Dakota duty is best noted for being the guards of Chief Sitting Bull. After returning to American soil in 1881, Sitting Bull and 200 of his followers surrendered at Fort Buford up near the Canadian border. In September of 81, he came to Fort Randall, where he was kept for nearly a year and a half before he was given permission to return to the Standing Rock Agency. A more colorful story of the Buffalo Soldiers we can find next door in Wyoming, and it involves the 9th Cavalry. The 9th was called in to help stop the Johnson County Range War, also called the War on Powder River of 1892. Originally, the 6th Cavalry was called in as peacekeepers, but they were accused of being too influenced by local politics, and so the 9th Cavalry was brought in as a more neutral force. Well, in 2 weeks, they marched up from Fort Robinson, they built their camp, rounded up the troublemakers, and pretty much got things straightened out. But during that short time, they still found an opportunity for another incident involving all the good elements of a Hollywood Western. A woman, insults at a saloon, a shootout, and the cavalry riding to the rescue. It all took place in Suggs, a tent city at the end of the railroad near present-day Arvada, Wyoming. E.D. Baker, a resident of Suggs at the time, told the story in the 1945-46 Westerners Brand book. He described it as about the liveliest 3 or 4 minutes he ever saw. So here's the story of the Suggs incident in Wyoming. Well, the Johnson County War erupted from years of friction between the big cattlemen with their large operations and the smaller landowners, called the rustlers. By 1892, 4 men and 1 woman who opposed the big cattlemen had been lynched or dry gulched, shot by hidden gunmen. Well, the 9th Cavalry entered Johnson County conflict on June 13th. The expedition consisted of 310 enlisted men and officers, and they set up Camp Benton's, 4 miles south of Suggs in southeastern Sheridan County, near present-day Arvada. Now, Suggs was an end-of-the-tracks tent town. It offered drinking, gambling, prostitution. But you added to this mix one Phil Dufresne. Now, Phil had been the city marshal in Buffalo in 85-86 and had served as a stock detective. He was also one of the invading cattlemen. But Dufresne had a talent for playing both sides of the field. He incited the soldiers against the locals, and he also was successful in inciting the locals against the soldiers. The residents of Suggs showed open hostility to the soldiers. Repeated and constant insults were heaped upon the men by a certain class on account of their being colored, it's reported. Well, on June 16th, Private Smith rode into Suggs to put up flyers, advertising for freighters, and an unauthorized companion, Private Champ, went with him. Now, Private Champ had heard that a prostitute he was familiar with was in Suggs. Well, he went to see her, but she was now living with a white man and was refused entry. So Champ and Smith went to a nearby saloon. Soon after their arrival, the woman's lover entered and put a gun to Champ's head. "Are you the soldiers who kicked on my door?" he asked, and he proceeded to insult the private. The situation was diffused by the bartender, who managed to let the 2 soldiers out the back door. They doubled up on a horse and raced away, but 100 yards from camp they were fired upon, and Private Smith took a bullet through his hat. The next night, about 20 of the soldiers sneaked past the guard and went into Suggs. The soldier pointed to the saloon and said, "There's the place, close on it." A signal shot was fired into the air, and then a volley was fired into the saloon. 1 man in the saloon was grazed on the arm, but otherwise no one was hurt. Men in the neighboring Rustler's saloon returned fire, and 2 horses that were tethered in the street died immediately. The soldiers retreated. People scattered, men, women, and children tripping over tent guy wires as they ran. Private Willis Johnson was killed. It's unknown whether he was killed by locals or by friendly fire. Private Champ was shot through the shoulder. Private William Tompkins shot through the hand. Well, shortly after that, reinforcements arrived. The commander and the remainder of the cavalry had arrived and reassured the town, gathered them from the sagebrush, reestablishing peace. The offending soldiers were arrested for being absent without leave. Dufresne, who had started the whole thing, was escorted to Gillette shortly thereafter. Champ, Smith, and Tompkins spent 3 months in jail awaiting trial, and then they were fined 50 cents each. Private Champ went on to later fight with the 10th Cavalry in the Spanish-American War. Smith became a teacher and a librarian at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. But it was in the aftermath of Wounded Knee that the 9th Cavalry completed one of the greatest cavalry rides in recorded military history. The 9th had been called in for help to help, and they completed a forced march of 103 miles in freezing to sub-zero temperatures in 22 hours. They arrived the day following the Wounded Knee Massacre, on December 30th, 1890. They heard reports that the 7th Cavalry, under command of Colonel James Forsyth, was besieged on White Clay Creek, with the Sioux commanding the heights on either side and threatening to cut off their retreat. The 7th Cavalry had hunkered down and were awaiting rescue. Major Henry and the 9th, without waiting to rest the horses, proceeded to the mouth of the canyon. And in a scene reminiscent of a movie's climax, he divided his troopers into 2 battalions, and urging their tired mounts into an exhausted trot, they swept both sides of the canyon. With the Hotchkiss gun firing away, the Buffalo soldiers surged forward, emitting screams of elation at getting into battle. And without losing a man, the Buffalo soldiers had recorded one of their most celebrated triumphs. Newspapers across the nation proclaimed that Henry's troops had saved Forsyth from the same fate as Custer's troops 14 years earlier. It was during that initial march of 103 miles that Corporal William Wilson of the 9th Cavalry performed his valiant ride that earned him the last Medal of Honor awarded during the Indian Wars period. His actions saving the lives of all the men and the animals of the 9th supply train when it came under attack. Locally, Fort Meade was to have one more last connection with our frontier Buffalo soldiers, and that took place in 1889. Colonel Joseph Tilford, who had been stationed at Fort Meade from its beginning in 1878, was transferred down to Fort Robinson, where he was placed in command now of the 9th Cavalry. But our state was going to have one more encounter with the 25th Infantry, the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps. Now this was an experimental unit, and it was comprised of members of the 25th Infantry stationed at Fort Missoula, Montana. Their mission was to test most thoroughly the bicycle as a means of transportation for troops. Their final experiment in this was to ride 1,900 miles from Fort Missoula, Montana to St. Louis, Missouri. For this, they used a specially designed bicycle called a safety bicycle, designed by the Spalding Company. Some of its special features: the tires were of equal size, and it had a covered chain drive. The trip lasted 41 days. Took them across mountains, deserts, cactus, snowstorms, bad water, and roads so bad that at times they decided to ride on the railroad tracks instead. One cyclist said, if you want to recreate what these men did, he said, take your bike to the top of a staircase, ride down it, carry it to the top, and repeat for the next 8 hours. This was done on a bicycle that weighed 32 pounds, had one gear, and they carried another 27 pounds of supplies, weapons, and ammunition. But they did have a good incentive to keep moving. They were only given a 2-day supply of food, and there was a food catch for them stashed every 100 miles. But they arrived safely in St. Louis, where they were greeted by a cheering crowd of 10,000 people. This is a map of their route. So they covered 5 states. On day 19 of the trip, July 2nd, 1896, they passed through Edgemont, South Dakota. A journal report for the day reads, the roads are sandy and dusty, necessitating much walking. The Corps expect to cross the South Dakota line about noon tomorrow, which will be the 3rd state traversed. The prospect for better roads and better water is encouraging. After researching the trip of the 25th Bicycle Corps, one hardcore bicyclist wrote, "Their trip proved two truths that we need to hold self-evident today. One, all men are created equal. And two, most men are nowhere near as tough as they were in 1897. Well, in closing, I'd like to leave you with a quote from the first commanding officer, General Benjamin Grierson. As he relinquished command of the 10th Cavalry, he said, "Always in the vanguard of civilization, the officers and men have cheerfully endured many hardships and privations, and in the midst of great danger steadfastly maintained a most gallant and zealous devotion to duty. It cannot fail, sooner or later, to meet with due recognition and reward." So I will attempt to answer questions.
Randy, do you know if they had their own officers or were they white?
Officers were white, non-commissioned officers were black. Thank you.
Remember during the first Monday Night Football in that era, Howard Cosell said there would never be a black quarterback.
I think he was proved wrong.
I guess.
Yes.
Where was Fort Hale in relation to modern times?
I want to back up to one of the Dakota maps.
Yeah,
there.
It's the second one up.
Yeah,
It's not
it's the one.
Is that Chamberlain? Is that near Chamberlain?
Yeah, it's a little bit north of Chamberlain. There's really nothing there to mark its location anymore. So if you Google Fort Hale, they will show you on a map where it was, but there's nothing there. There's no foundations or anything anymore to show it.
Kind of like Fort Sully
Yeah.
up in Sully County.
Were the
Yes.
KKK active at the time they were here, or is that the reason the KKK got in?
The KKK in this region was not active at that time. At least my understanding of it is that they came in the early 1900s, and most of their activity in our region was primarily anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, not anti-black.
During the Korean War, that's when they started integrating all the troops, and they wondered how that would come to be. Well, we all know this. That was wonderful.
Mhm.
And yet, during World War II, the colored people had an air force. I forget what it was called, but the bomber pilots would ask them to be escort over Germany because they would be more daring and courageous than the white pilots.
In the one article, I think it was a 1973 article, again, it's one of the early references to the term Buffalo Soldier in the Army-Navy Review. They were talking about that the general quality of the Buffalo Soldier seemed to be higher than the average quality of the white soldiers, and they were wondering why that was. And one of their officers said that during peacetime, it seemed to be that the best of the black men joined the army, whereas in peacetime it was like the lower level whites would join the army.
Disadvantaged.
And yeah, so the blacks definitely saw it as a way of social achievement, of improving their status in society. whereas a lot of the whites saw it as kind of it's a way to keep from starving to death, but I really don't want to do this. And
When
Yes.
did the term, the Buffalo Soldier start being disused?
say that again.
When did the term Buffalo Soldier stop being used?
Stop being used?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the term in
Mhm.
the Spanish-American War.
Right.
I'm not sure if it was used in World War One, was it?
Not that I have heard. And then again in World War II, as the troops there were more of them, they became more integrated, that term was stop. And then again, it was the late 60s where it got popular recognition and started being used. But it always refers to the frontier soldiers and up through the Spanish-American War.
I'm wondering how many families were involved, were attached to these troops. You know, how many were here that were single or had families that didn't follow them, or,
And I have no idea. Generally speaking, the Army, with both whites and blacks, did not support the families moving.
okay.
There was no financial provision for that, there was no housing provided for families. Officers tended to do it a little bit more because they were just better paid and they had better housing. But it was not something that the Army encouraged. They saw it as an encumbrance to ship the families along around.
How much longer did the bicycle troop continue on, or was that it?
Not much because, shortly after this, the car is really starting to make itself known, and it's a much more powerful means. Here at Fort Meade, though, we also had an experimental run using the bicycle. They went from here on a scouting run to Sundance and back. And the way they would do it is the bicycles would go like a day ahead of the mounted troops to map their terrain, to pick out campsites, and then they would ride back and report. The major advantage was that it was quieter than the horse. Yeah, you didn't have to feed it. The difference between there two and the 25th though is the men from Fort Meade, they didn't carry a full rifle and everything. They just carried a pistol and like a day's worth of emergency rations because they were just going out and coming back. They weren't doing the long distance trek.
Do you know if any of those bicycles still make around?
I have no
That
idea.
would be fascinating.
Yeah. Yes.
There's a monument to the Buffalo Soldiers at Fort Leavenworth.
Mm-hmm. That's the one that Colin Powell dedicated. There are about, I want to say about 9 statues dedicated to the Black Frontier Soldiers, different places around the country. And it just, there's probably about a dozen books on it. So it's a lot of good information out there that you can find. Kathy?
About those bicycle troops, I know that the cavalry had to bring farriers with them to shoe horses that they were shooting. Did they have mechanics who fixed flat tires? They
That's,
must have had a lot of flat tires going across the countryside.
that was part of the supplies they carried, were spare inner tubes and an emergency wrench kit. So I'm not a cyclist myself, but I understand that our bikes today don't weigh 32 pounds. And yeah, so it's the more I talk to people, the more impressive what these guys did. And the fact that, they didn't have any paved roads and really no roads at all for the most part until they hit Nebraska. Yes, sir.
And phasing out the forts in South Dakota, how does Fort Meade come into that picture? The forts.
I'm sorry, say that again?
As they phase out the forts
Okay.
in South Dakota, how did Fort Meade set with that as long as, say, Fort Jackson, Nebraska?
Fort
Robinson,
Meade
I mean.
was one of the last frontier forts to go out. We remained an active post until 1944. And then it transitioned almost immediately into a VA hospital. And so it's been a government installation from its beginning. But yeah, so it was a fort for 66 years, which makes it unusually long for a frontier post.
What about, Fort Robinson? You know when that was phased out?
I honestly don't.
When we,
I think it lasted a little bit longer when there was still a fort in 1942, because that's where all of our horses were decommissioned, was at Fort Robinson. But you know, I've never really looked at their history, so I don't know.
in mid-seventies, we moved to Edgemont, and we got acquainted with one of Bill Bailey, and he was a black man that was in the cavalry there at Fort Robinson, and he was older when, you know, and I was just kind of curious, you know, how long that the Fort Robinson, because he moved into Edgemont then,
Okay.
so how long he was active, you know, didn't think to ask him then.
I want to say, yeah, into World War II, because they had a prisoner of war camp down there as
That's
well.
right, that's right.
And so I think it lasted a little longer than Fort Meade, but again, I don't know exactly.
I
Yes, ma'am.
think they had like a dog training camp down there for the soldiers at Fort Robinson. I don't remember if it was First World War or Second World War. They have a plaque down there that talks
Okay.
about
It's
it.
in their museum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say it's, yeah, I just made it to Fort Sisseton last year, and I've never been to Fort Robinson, so yeah, I have a lot of places I need to visit.
One of our history days, Mark Rambo gave a tour of downtown and what sat there in the first years, and he referred to Abe Hill Saloon being in that area that's open by Weimer's downtown, if that helps people.
That's his second establishment.
That was the second one. So the first one was the
Well,
halfway.
they both operated at the same time.
Oh,
Halfway House was the one out on Fairview Creek, and then he had one in town.
okay.
Says Fort Robinson was decommissioned in 47.
Okay. And you just knew that off the top of your head, right? So Fort Robinson was decommissioned in 1847.
You beat me to it.
I remember you mentioned the name Robinson. Robinson is one of the soldiers here,
Mhm.
but I can't recall in what the context was. Was it
He may have been the
honored? Someone?
business entrepreneur, or was he the nurse? He was the nurse at the hospital.
I can't help but think of the Robeson black musician who left this country because he couldn't get work and ended up. So I just wondered if there was a connection, but we'd have to Google that too. What was the first name on this man?
William.
William. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be around for a bit if you want to come up and talk. Thank you.